Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we're starting a multi-week series on the Exodus, where we'll look at various aspects of the story and how it matches with what we know of the archaeology and the history of the ancient world. Be sure you subscribe so you don't miss those videos as they come out. We're going to start this series by looking at the life of Moses, the man who led the Exodus. What do we know about him from the Bible? Does the text seem to accurately reflect the realities of the ancient world? Is there any archaeological evidence about Moses that can corroborate the biblical account? Was he even a real person? Let's start digging and find out.
The story of the Exodus starts with Moses. Moses is a larger-than-life figure in the Bible. He's perhaps Israel's greatest prophet, and through him God is said to have worked incredible miracles. But the existence of Moses is only attested in the Bible. We have no other reference or allusion to him in any other sources, either textual or archaeological. So it's a reasonable question to ask if he was a historical man or a myth. But perhaps a better question is how much of what the Bible tells us about Moses is historical, at least historical as we understand it. We need to remember that writers of ancient history weren't concerned with recording facts and details the way historians are today. They were more concerned with conveying the importance of the people and events they were writing about, and helping their readers understand and interpret them. With that in mind, by closely reading the biblical text and comparing it with data we have outside the Bible, we can piece together some broader context for the early years of an historical Moses. The story of Moses begins, not surprisingly, with his birth. Moses is perhaps the most important figure in Israelite history as their greatest prophet and lawgiver, and in the ancient world, such important figures often had unusual birth stories. Exodus 1 tells us that at the time of Moses' birth, Pharaoh was worried about the growing Hebrew population, so he ordered any sons born to the Hebrews to be killed by throwing them into the Nile. In Exodus 2, we're told that when Moses was born, his mother hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she placed him in a papyrus basket and left him in the reeds along the Nile. Here he was discovered by one of Pharaoh's daughters and taken into Pharaoh's household. Even though she recognized him as a Hebrew, she had pity on him. And Moses' sister was one of Pharaoh's daughter's attendants, and she was able to take the baby Moses to his mother for her to nurse him. Thus his life was spared, and he remained safe in Pharaoh's household. If you spent any time around church growing up, you've probably heard this story. What you probably didn't hear is that this story has a lot of parallels with other stories in the ancient world. This kind of story is so common, there's actually a name for it: the exposed child motif. In this motif, children who would grow up to be someone of great importance are often exposed or abandoned, but then through divine intervention are recovered and raised to greatness. There are many notable examples of this motif in ancient Near Eastern stories. For example, the Akkadian king Sargon the Great is said to have been born to a priestess, someone who was supposed to live a life of chastity. So he was put in a basket in the Euphrates. He was then recovered and given a new life where he grew into the charismatic and conquering king. Moses' story has been linked to this motif for obvious reasons, but there are significant differences between Moses' birth story and the traditional motif. In a review of the exposed child motif, one prominent scholar, Donald Redford, has identified 3 reasons for the child to be left exposed. The first is shameful circumstances surrounding the birth, like a chaste priestess getting pregnant. The second is a powerful figure like a king trying to kill the child. And the third is a general massacre that threatens the life of the child. The birth story of Sargon fits the first category. The stories of Cyrus the Great and Oedipus fit the second. The birth stories of Jesus and Moses would fit best with the third. Also in this motif, the child is often saved explicitly through divine providence. And while this may be implied with Moses, it isn't explicitly stated. While there may be some similarities between the exposed child motif and the Moses story doesn't fit the motif as neatly as some would want. After this birth narrative, the text of Exodus 2 jumps ahead to Moses killing an Egyptian who was abusing a Hebrew and then fleeing to Midian. We're led to assume he was raised at some level by the daughter of Pharaoh. She drew him from the river and named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." He was given an Egyptian name. His name comes from the Egyptian root meaning to give birth, and was a very common part of Egyptian New Kingdom names. We see the Mosa in names like Tutmos, Ahmos, Tamos, and so on. His adoptive mother was an Egyptian princess, though we don't know which one. If the pharaoh during the Exodus was Ramses the Great, as is commonly believed, then this princess would have been one of Ramses' sisters or half-sisters. Now, while Moses may have had an adoptive mother who was an Egyptian princess, he would not necessarily have been raised as a true Egyptian prince. He was raised in the court of Egypt and trained in the ways of Egypt, but more likely as something like a political hostage rather than as a royal. This practice of taking political hostages and training them in Egyptian customs is attested in numerous Egyptian records. It was not really a common practice in Egypt until the reign of Thutmose III, but it grew in prominence during the New Kingdom period. In the Amarna letters of the 14th century, we see Asiatic kings saying they're sending their sons to Egypt as hostages, where they would be essentially Egyptianized and ultimately returned to their homeland to rule as loyal vassals. Moses may have been one such Asiatic captive who learned Egyptian ways, and perhaps even on behalf of the Hebrews. So this seemingly innocuous fact about Moses' life, that he was rescued and raised by a princess, is actually quite plausible and may reflect a historical tradition. It, however, is not the most famous aspect of Moses' life. Some of the more famous stories of his life also have curious parallels with other historical figures, which have led many to question their historical validity. His birth is one such event, and now we'll look at another, his time in the desert of Midian. Moses came to Midian when he fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian. A reasonable response if he were raised as something like a political hostage and not a privileged royal. Midian was likely somewhere in northern Saudi Arabia or southern Jordan, a place that was notably outside of New Kingdom Egyptian control or influence. In Midian, Moses met Jethro and married Jethro's daughter Zipporah, and while tending sheep in the desert, Moses encountered the burning bush and spoke with God, who there revealed his name Yahweh to Moses. And it was there that Yahweh commissioned Moses to return to Egypt and lead the Hebrews out of slavery. Some scholars have noted parallels with Moses and an Egyptian story called the story of Sinuhe. This story was written during the Middle Kingdom period, but remained popular through the New Kingdom period. In the story, Sinuhe is an Egyptian official who flees from Egypt after the ruling pharaoh is assassinated. Sinuhe fears he will be associated with the conspiracy, so he escapes to the land of Canaan. There he encounters a local sheikh or clan chieftain named Amunenshi. He marries the chieftain's daughter and has sons. In the course of the story, Sinuhe fights an epic battle and is victorious in single combat. But in his old age, he longs to return to his homeland and be buried with proper Egyptian rites. He's contacted by the pharaoh and told he can return home, where he dies and is given a proper, sumptuous burial in Egyptian custom. While the story is likely fictional, its events are plausible, and it had an enduring popularity for centuries in ancient Egypt. Now, I'm sure if you're familiar with the Bible, you may note some similarities between the story of Sinuhe and other biblical stories. Scholars have connected this story with Joseph's story, as well as the story of David and Goliath's single combat. As for Moses, scholars have noted parallels with Sinuhe fleeing Egypt, fearing that the pharaoh would believe he was involved in an assassination. Like Moses, Sinuhe finds refuge amongst Asiatic Bedouins. He meets a friendly sheikh and marries his eldest daughter. And ultimately, he returns to the court of Pharaoh. While these details parallel the story of Moses quite closely, the story of Sinuhe predates not only the writing of the life of Moses in Exodus, but even the earliest possible dating of the events of Moses' life. So it is possible that the story of Sinuhe, which was still popular in the New Kingdom Egypt, provided a literary framework for telling the story of Moses, and that aspects of this famous story supplemented parts of Moses' story. So with two important episodes of Moses' life possibly being influenced by common literary frameworks, we have to ask the question, was Moses a real person?
So, was Moses a real person? From an academic perspective, we really just can't say for certain whether or not Moses was a real person. He isn't attested in archaeological or textual sources outside the Bible. Some aspects of his life as recorded in the Bible seem to mimic well-known tropes or other literary traditions. So it's a reasonable question to ask if he was a real historical figure, or if what we have are just a collection of literary devices that are copied over and applied to Moses. You could argue that Moses was not a real person. He's only attested in one source, the Bible. But we have to remember that a lot of what we accept as historical fact is also only attested in a single source. Famous people and events are often only preserved in one piece of writing. but many of those things are not widely dismissed as unhistorical. So just because Moses only shows up in the Bible doesn't mean that you can dismiss his historicity out of hand. We've seen that practices of the Ramesside period of Egypt fit well with some aspects of Moses' biography, like growing up at the Egyptian court and learning Egyptian customs. But how do we handle the elements of plausible historicity with those that seem to be borrowing from known templates or tropes, like the exposed child motif and even aspects of the Sinuhe story? And what makes the most sense, and the position that we hold here at Beneath the Bible, is that Moses was a historical figure, and one of great importance. Because he was so important, in the telling of his life story, familiar literary devices were used to communicate not just historical details about Moses' life, but more importantly, to communicate who Moses was and what he accomplished. Now, does this mean that what the Bible tells us about Moses isn't true? Well, in a way, that depends on your definition of true. Does the Bible give a painstaking account of Moses' life where every detail is historically accurate? No, probably not. But again, that's not the point of writing history in the ancient world. Does the Bible convey Moses as a seminal figure in the history of Israel, his connections to Egypt and the ways God used him to free the Israelites from bondage and lead them to the Promised Land? Yes, that's the truth about Moses that the Bible wants to tell us. Now, that truth is not just about what Moses did, but it's about why we should care about what Moses did, and what difference it still makes for us today. Finally, to understand the importance of Moses, at least as Christians, we can't miss the way that the life of Moses foreshadows another important biblical figure, probably the most important one of all. Much later in the Bible, we meet another person who was also saved at birth from a mass-murdering tyrant, fled the opposite way from Canaan to Egypt, returned to his homeland, and grew up into greatness by leading God's people from bondage to freedom. Now, that person, of course, was Jesus, who led the way from slavery to sin and death to the freedom of eternal life in God's kingdom. Maybe that's the most important thing the Bible wants to communicate about Moses, the way he anticipates the one who would deliver us from bondage once and for all. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.